Hi, everyone. It's Friday, May 15th, and welcome to World Review with Ivo Daalder, the Chicago Council's weekly look at the news from around the world. Ivo's traveling, lucky man once again. I'm Carla Anne Robbins, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Director of Brooke College's Master of International Affairs program, and a former reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Today, we're going to be looking at President Trump's first major foreign trip of his second term. And like his first term, he chose to pitch U.S. business and investment opportunities to the Gulf states' billionaires. And while he continues to diss America's traditional European allies, Mr. Trump seems determined to win friends and influence people in more unexpected places. During his visit to Saudi Arabia, he met with Syria's new president, a former jihadist and al-Qaeda allies. And announcing that the U.S. was lifting all sanctions on Syria, he declared, quote, "Now it's their time to shine." Then we're going to discuss the Ukraine-Russia peace summit that isn't a summit. Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy showed up in Ankara, Turkey on Thursday. Vladimir Putin stayed home and sent a delegation of aides to Istanbul. And as this podcast is going out on Friday, a so-called technical meeting of lower-level officials had wrapped up in Istanbul. But President Trump told reporters that nothing is going to happen until he meets with the Russian leader. Did Putin get the best of this? What's going on? And what can we expect? And finally, the China-Russia trade war. Both Washington and Beijing claim victory after their negotiators agreed on a 90-day ceasefire that lowered U.S. tariff rates on Chinese goods from 145% to 30% and retaliatory Chinese rates from 125% to 10%. Who blinked? And what's the lesson for all the other countries targeted by President Trump on so-called Liberation Day? Here with us to discuss all these issues from London, Prashant Rao, senior editor for Semaphore. From Berlin, Anna Sauerbrey, the foreign editor of Germany's Die Zeit. And from Washington, my old colleague from the Wall Street Journal, Matt Kaminski, former editor-in-chief of Politico Europe. Prashant, Anna, and Matt, great to see you all again. Thank you so much for doing this. I know it's always a great disappointment not to have Ivo with you. You're all very tolerant of me, so thank you for doing it. So, Prashant, let's start with President Trump's trip to the Middle East. There were sword dances. There were no glowing orbs this time, which is a great disappointment. And in Qatar, there were red cyber trucks, which escorted the president to his meeting at the palace. And there were a few other surprises on this trip, including big advanced chip sales to the UAE, what might be a declaration of a Trump doctrine if one can take his words seriously. At an investment conference in Riyadh, he denounced nation building and what he called interventionalism, declaring that the U.S. would no longer be, quote, giving you lectures on how to live. So what were your big takeaways from this visit?
So I think how one interprets the Trump visit does really depend to a large degree on where they are geographically. It really struck me as we sort of covered this Trump visit, how just different the narratives were of the trip in DC versus the region itself. And part of it is, of course, I with the proviso that, of course, the Gulf does not have a free press and all these things, just the interpretation of the things that Trump said and the importance attached to them were just so diametrically different. So just to go through a few of those things, I mean, you talked about the Syria announcement, which was honestly astounding. Syrian friends of mine said that they had tears in their eyes. It's easy to forget through all of this what Syria has gone through in the past 40 years. And to have this kind of come is, largely a surprise to Trump's own team to some degree, was astonishing. This huge focus on trade, on investment, on deals is, again, if we interpret it from the DC viewpoint, it is, I think, understandably and correctly a question as to how much of this is real, how much of it is sort of pandering to Trump himself in order to have curry favor with the United States. But I think when we look at it from the Gulf as well, one way to think about it is, even when Trump went last time, there was a real overriding focus on terrorism in the Gulf and in the Middle East more broadly. And when Barack Obama went in 2009, there was a big discussion about sort of support for democracy and support for terror and fighting terrorism and all these kinds of things. And Trump was there to do business. And that is, I think, a subtle but really important shift in how the United States deals with that world and with that part of the world and how it views it, and certainly how that region perceives itself in the context of the United States. And then I think in terms of, planes was also just a really interesting kind of split screen in that, I think if you were to say Qatar and planes, the kind of news line could have been two diametrically different things. One of which was, of course, the 747 that the Qataris have apparently offered to serve as, Air Force One temporarily, et cetera. I mean, the other way you could say it is that, $96 billion worth of contracts were announced for Boeing to provide 210 wide-body jets to Qatar Airways, followed by further sales to the United Arab Emirates. Those are huge business deals. It's all this is like these numbers sometimes feel like cartoon numbers because they're so enormous, but they are just astonishing. And then the big takeaway, I think, we could talk about the politics and the sort of geopolitics of it, but to me, the real tangible thing here was about artificial intelligence and chips, and the sort of Emirati focus in particular on AI and chips, but also the Saudis trying to catch up. I mean, there's so many layers to this. One of this is Saudi competition with the Emirates to be the sort of AI hub of the region. The Emirati desire to be, what they say is like one of the three pillars of the kind of global AI world. And this enormous spending on chips, on data centers, on power, to sort of really be a hub for what they see as, the next technological revolution. And, this is all a very long-winded way of saying, there's a reason CSIS sort of said in its preview of Trump's trip to the Gulf that the Gulf is Trump's happy place, because, nobody asks him about the 747. Nobody asks him about all of the various other things that are happening. But at the same time, he gets to announce some really kind of enormous deals. And I think one of the dangers in interpreting this solely through a DC lens, not that it's not valid, is that we lose sight of some of the really tangible changes that are happening to American foreign policy, not just in the kind of what can often, I think, as seen from London and DC, the kind of chaotic Trump foreign policy of what does this mean and stuff. There is a really profound shift that is happening in how the United States deals with the Gulf, interprets the Gulf, and sees the wider Middle East more generally. And that's what I sort of take away.
I know. This chip deal, the Times had this headline, snarky, outsourcer in chief. The Biden administration spent an enormous amount of time, but also so did the first Trump administration, saying to the Europeans, don't buy Chinese technology, make sure that technology also doesn't leak to China. And here's Trump going around selling hundreds of thousands of advanced chips to the UAE. There are reports that they're also going to sell them to the Saudis. They're supporting this big AI campus in Abu Dhabi. There's a big debate even inside the U.S. government and among the U.S. tech community. Is more better for AI? Does everybody grow together, or are we going to fall behind even more to the Chinese if we go this route? What's the reaction where you guys are sitting with this? Do they feel that that we've been lecturing you too much on your deals with China, and now we're just going to go out and get rich off of our sales?
Well, I think Europeans are still very cautious when it comes to deals with China or Saudi Arabia, and this is something they have actually learned from the Biden administration. There's also always been voices in Germany, particularly in the Christian Democratic Party and the Green Party, who have cautioned against business being viewed just as business. But as I said, we have to always consider the security dimension, and this is something that really has sunk in, at least in Germany, under the administration that just went out, under the Ampel government. And I think the new incoming administration under Friedrich Merz is pretty much looking at it the same way. But what they should consider is that actually Biden's policies haven't been very successful, because he has sanctioned, for example, China, and his administration has very much looked at not selling certain products. It has pressured countries like the Netherlands to go along and restrict the shipment of advanced chip-making technology to China. And yet China is now making some of the most advanced chips in the world and has some of the most advanced AI applications, at least from what I can tell as a user. So it seems like those are proven right who said, well, this is only going to put more innovation pressure on the countries that we are sanctioning or that we are shielding from the import of certain technologies. So maybe Europe too will reconsider its security strategy in that regard. But I think it's still too early to tell.
So, Matt, you may want to get in on Chefs, but I was going to ask you a question about Israel, your choice. President Trump didn't go to Israel on this trip, and before he left, there was talk of this growing rift with Bibi Netanyahu over a U.S.-only deal with the Houthis, this revived interest in negotiations with Iran, direct talks with Hamas that led to the release of an Israeli-American soldier. Hamas said after these negotiations that it had an understanding with the U.S. that the release is going to lead to more humanitarian aid for Gaza. The U.S. called for a permanent ceasefire, although on the trip, President Trump seemed to be back in Bibi's camp when he said that Gaza should be made into a so-called freedom zone. Did we come away with any better understanding of Gaza, or was this a Gaza-free trip?
I mean, I think the best way to understand Trump is that it may have been Maggie Haberman who noted this, that Trump thinks in 10-minute increments at most. So if we are trying to come together with some kind of understanding of a Trump doctrine or a kind of a larger strategic move, it's difficult. It's difficult because it's so disorienting that I think there's one reading, and I know a lot of people who are strong supporters of Israel, hugely worried about, this outreach to Iran, and that he didn't go to Israel on this trip. This love in with Bibi Netanyahu doesn't seem as strong as it seemed to be even a couple of weeks ago, and I think the Europeans are obviously also very concerned that clearly Europe is a second or third order priority for this administration. But when it comes back to Israel, I don't think we have any more clarity whether, and I think Iran is really the key to all this, something we haven't really touched on, that if so he loves the bling, he loves the deals, and having spent quite a bit of time both in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia in the last couple of months, it's inescapable, the sense of sort of optimism and dynamism that you get from those countries. But what overhangs everything is Iran, and to the degree that Gaza is in this, I guess, a proxy conflict, a main conflict for Israel itself. And I think the key will be, is Trump really seriously going to pursue a kind of peace deal with Iran that will be a slightly better version of what Obama got, which hugely worries, let's say, the Netanyahu government, and it hugely worries people in Washington who are kind of Iran hawks? Or is he going to sort of do the usual thing where he'll try this? If it doesn't work, then he's going to green light, an Israeli strike on Iran. And if that happens, everything we just talked about will be not irrelevant, but completely forgotten in a few months, because that is, as the region is trying to change itself, the possibility of a larger scale war with Iran kind of hangs over everything. And we don't have any clarity on that coming out of this trip. On Gaza itself, I guess we're not doing the Trump palace on the Mediterranean in Gaza City anymore, and I think there's as much uncertainty there as there is about what's going to happen with the Ukraine conflict, because there's not a clear path forward, really.
So you were just in Saudi, and what do you think that Trump was hearing about Iran there? Was he hearing, go for some sort of a deal that constrains their nuclear program, but don't be serious about actually bombing them if they don't do it? Or, I can never really figure out where the Saudis stand on that, or are they going through that? If you're going to shoot at the king, make sure you take him out.
Yeah, I think both in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh, you have probably the pragmatists are winning out over some. It's going to sound funny, some sort of Gulf version of neoconservatives, that distrust Iran, don't like Iran, see Iran as a threat. But both these places are so consumed with protecting their efforts to reform and to get really rich, pushing AI. So you have in Saudi Arabia, MBS, who was the first person who greeted Trump on his first visit overseas as president, is really, initially he started out with adventures going out, after the Houthis, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul. None of those things went very well, so he's turned very much inward and really wants to make sure that his grand project of a youthful, modern Saudi Arabia, one day even a tourist destination for the world's masses, comes off successfully. Similarly, in the UAE, a very successful, think Hong Kong times whatever, how many, there's 8 Emirates, but there are really only 2 big cities. They are very pragmatic. They've also pulled back from going after the Houthis. They don't want adventurism, because any sense of any adventurism or any even suggestion of adventurism, military adventurism, is a break on their top priority, which is building out technology, building out actually clean energy, believe it or not, protecting the dirty energy, which funds everything, and making sure that Dubai and Abu Dhabi remain magnets for capital, but increasingly talent from across the world, not just sort of the taxi drivers and the housekeepers you see, but the world's top venture capitalists. Ray Dalio just moved one of his family offices over there. So they want to be high-end, sort of magnet for high-end talent and capital. And Iran's the biggest threat to that. And I don't think they want to take any risks. So I think they actually would want something which takes this off the table for the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks. So Anna, Ukraine. So if this weren't about a brutal war, this week's, it's Ankara, no, it's Istanbul, it's a presidential summit, it's a technical meeting. It was sort of like a bedroom farce. I know this is a breaking story. Last time I checked the wires, the Russians were claiming there'd been an agreement on a POW exchange. That there were European leaders on the phone with Zelenskyy and with Trump. Was there progress here, or was the lesson here that Putin was just trying to buy more time and that he played everybody?
Well, I think there was very little progress, unfortunately, that we really see. So as we speak on Friday afternoon, it seems like the meeting was over after only 2 hours. And the only thing that we know has tangibly appeared from it is that another prisoner of war exchange was agreed on, 1,000 prisoners of war exchange between the two sides. So this kind of exchange we have seen before. So that's not really a breakthrough of any kind. And at the same time, I think it was a good moment for world diplomacy, for European politics on Ukraine. A couple of things I would take away from it. First, I think this week it became clear for everybody to see that Putin does not want peace. He's sending a delegation to Istanbul with a very, I think, with no way to really negotiate anything, and it was only like lower rank officials who really went. So I think it became clear for everyone to see that it's just gesturing in that direction, but it's more tactics by Putin. And I think this is really important, not least in the political debate in my country, Germany, but also in other European countries and in the United States, where critics of the government's course on Ukraine kept pretending that Putin wanted peace and that it was Ukraine and the West preventing it or denying negotiations. And I think second, it's a good thing because this is how negotiations usually start. And I think there's a misperception, at least in Germany, and I'd like to hear about your countries, that it just needs this one big peace summit and we just need one big country like the United States or China to, for once, get Putin and Zelenskyy to sit down, and everything will be good. And I think as we observe this, and German media have been very prominently reporting on the meeting today, I think this gives people a better understanding that it's a very, very long way. And this is how peace negotiations usually go. They take a lot of time. There's a lot of failures. There's disruption. There's break-offs. And then maybe at some point you get together again. And the third positive thing I would take away is that the past few weeks have shown that Donald Trump's first strategy, trying to end this war, has failed. He has put maximum pressure on the weaker party, Ukraine, and has offered the stronger party, Russia, everything it wanted, pretty much. And yet he did not succeed to get Putin to the table in Istanbul today. So Trump seems to be trying a different strategy now, putting pressure on Putin. And this is, of course, a good thing, not least because it brings Europe and the US closer together again. Trump's now needs Europe in this game. He needs Europe for the sanctions that are now put on Russia, the new sanctions, and the European Union has prepared a sanctions package. And he needs Europe to keep up the weapons deliveries to augment the pressure on Putin to get to the table. The question I have, of course, is how long will this last? He's like a 1 minute president, so 1 minute one strategy and another minute another strategy. So I would really like to hear what you think, Matt and Prashant and Carla. Like, how long is this going to last?
Prashant,
yeah. I was going to just jump in. The striking thing is that the idea used to be that Putin had all the time in the world, and actually the Ukrainians were the ones who had this sense of urgency. You know, there was the meat grinder out on the Eastern Front, the kind of lack of U.S. support. And I'm not sensing that's completely turned upside down, but actually I think it's changing. I think the Ukrainians now feel they're buying some time, and they need time. They need time for the Europeans to get serious about support, ramping up, let's say, military industrial production, really strengthening the kind of coalition behind it. And they've stabilized the Eastern Front. You don't have the sense that the Russians are about to break through. Pretty demoralized, pretty weakened military. And I think it's also come with the realization in Ukraine that, actually, we can live with some territorial sort of exchanges. But what we're really fighting for is to secure our sovereignty and our place in the West. And that requires real security guarantees. And maybe Trump needs a little bit more time to kind of come around to where we are. And that's hasn't happened yet, but it's starting to happen. And if you're Ukrainian, you're not super happy, but you're feeling much better about life than you did that day in February when Zelenskyy was in the White House and got berated by JD and Donald.
So that's both very optimistic. I'm not feeling as optimistic as Matt and Anna. Prashant, are you feeling optimistic? I will say that Starmer has been really quite doughty about this. I mean, he went to Kyiv. He's in Istanbul today. They've been on the phone twice with Donald Trump. Coming away, although to me, I really feel like Putin has played, Trump certainly, and my fear is that he's going to play Trump again, and Putin managed to sort of they seemed after this Kyiv meeting to be utterly, completely, think that the Americans were all in for this 30-day ceasefire or major sanctions. And then the bright and shiny object of the meeting came up, and now Trump is saying nothing's going to happen unless I have my meeting with Putin. Prashant, am I the odd person out here on feeling like Putin's coming out ahead on this?
I think so far he has, right? Like, so in the sort of 3 odd months of almost 4 months of the Trump presidency, that has certainly been the case. But I tend to, not that I'm optimistic, I think maybe a better way to phrase it is that I think all of us are probably tempering our pessimism in that we are just recalibrating, just because, exactly as I think Anna got it right in that I tend to agree with that sense that this is going to be a long and drawn out process, right? I mean, this is not going to be that, there will be peace by June. the sort of the 24 hours and the 100 days that the Trump administration initially sort of promised was always fanciful. Now we're coming to that realization. And I don't know, I think Matt's characterization is right, that like we are seeing maybe not a flip, but we are seeing something change, in that no longer does, Trump and the Trump administration kind of just unilaterally solely pressure Ukraine. We are seeing at least some noises that there is, recognition that Putin is slow walking this and is, playing for time, and perhaps thinks that he has all the time in the world. And I think that is eroding. That doesn't mean that I don't think qualify as optimism. I just think if you were to say this is where we'll be in May, and it's far, far from a sort of Ukrainian capitulation, far from a sort of one-sided negotiation. And in fact, if anything, it looks like the United States is coming around to the notion that, Ukraine is the party that it has more in sort of allyship with, and that actually the reverse Nixon that was, touted back in January and February is probably fanciful. Once we sort of start, I think we're seeing more and more of this as time goes on. And I'm just kind of struck by how it hasn't been that long since he came into office. I think we should just like calibrate a little bit. He's still got 33 more months in office. Even longer than that, sort of 45 more months, right? And so as a result, this idea that, this sort of whole change just not that long has passed, and actually quite a bit has changed. And the direction of travel of this change is largely in Kyiv's favor, though not entirely, would be kind of my rough characterization.
There seems to be... Yes, sorry, Matt, go on.
Go ahead, Carla.
No, Trump, as Matt said, is very changeable about these things. I will give Zelenskyy credit for having, with an enormous amount of help from the European leaders, and Starmer in particular, Zelensky's getting much better on managing Trump. And I think he learned a lot from that meeting in the White House, and Starmer's really done a good job in particular of coaching him. That said, you've got people around Trump. I mean, Kellogg, I don't think is much of a player, but I think, the other, Lutnick seems to be in love with this idea of big business deals with Russia. I can't really figure out what Russia has to offer there. And Wickoff seems to really believe this notion. They seem to be inertially on this notion that we're still going to cut big business deals with Russia, and that Russia's very much on our side. And if you look at the turnout of the number of Americans who were in Turkey because they really believed that there was going to be a major meeting there. And then Trump came back and said, well, why should Putin show up if I'm not going to be there? He almost seemed to be, running interference for Putin at that point. So, anyway, I hope that there is going to be progress here. Matt, you're going to say something?
No, I was going to say that I think in all the discussions, both at the highest level and certainly in the media, the amount of time we talk about Ukraine is completely reversely proportional of how actually Ukraine is relevant to the outcome here and what is driving all this in the first place. I'll just say briefly about the U.S. The fight in the U.S. not about Ukraine. It's about whether the internationalists or the isolationists, kind of roughly speaking, win out. But there's so little time and brain time spent on trying to understand what is Putin trying to do? Why is he doing it? Or as a part of the challenge that there's no journalists in Moscow anymore, there are very few diplomats. So instead, we have so much coming out of Kiev, out of the front. But for Putin, there's a reason why he started this war. And there's a reason why he will keep fighting this war until he sees a reason to stop fighting the war. The war's been very good for Putin, and Trump has been also pretty good for Putin as well, because the war has let him effectively do the thing that is most important to Vladimir Putin, which is solidify his hold on power. It's let him repress domestically. It's let him kind of overhaul the economy to a sort of a military footing. It's solidified his alliance with China. And in the end, this is how Putin stays in power. Putin's greatest fear is that he ends up like Gaddafi in the ditch outside of Tripoli 12 years ago. That image is planted in his head. He knows that he's vulnerable. So that's why he's going to keep fighting until he's given a reason not to keep fighting it. And the reason has to have something that reassures him that this is actually in his personal self-interest will secure the future prospects of his own regime. For now, very happy to keep at the war.
Prashant, do you really have your hand up like you're in my class? It's please, Mr. Rao, please go ahead.
Trying to engage in discussion in a sort of this, as we once did, in a common, civilized way. I think, the corollary to what Matt said as well is that, in some ways, it doesn't matter what Lutnick thinks or what Witkoff thinks or whether Kellogg is, up or down in the negotiations. It matters what Trump thinks. And that's what we learned from, his first administration. Actually, Trump's policies, as Anna said, he's a one-minute president, right? But we have to actually calibrate our own sort of thoughts about this to that because, to some degree, Witkoff is a conduit, right? And as is Lutnick. And we saw, with the sort of tariffs, that when Navarro was gone for 2 weeks, the tariff argument completely changed because Bessent came up and was in ascendance. And actually, everything gravitates around the president in a way that is unique among sort of recent history in the United States. And so, as Trump is shifting, to some degree, I tend to think that what Witkoff thinks and what Lutnick thinks is not really kind of the thing that we should focus on too much, just because he has it to some degree. Trump is one of the kind of things that I found, Trump is correct about over the course of his presidency. He does illuminate certain truths that we sometimes don't acknowledge. And he is correct that this thing only works if him and Putin are in the room. And we might find it, offensive the way he says it, or think that all the things he's saying are wrong. But actually, that is an elemental truth. That if Trump is not involved in this, it just won't work. And it's
I think I agree. I think it's down to Putin and Trump, and I think this is also why today was very illuminating because it shows something about the motives they both have. I think Trump's main motive now, as he pivots, shows that he really wants peace in Ukraine. And he doesn't want it for Ukraine, of course, and he doesn't want it for Russia, but he wants it for himself. And if one strategy to get there doesn't work, he will just pivot to another strategy. And I also agree with Matt. It shows where Putin stands. And it's for, as Matt said, for domestic reasons, but it's also because he still thinks he can win on the battlefield. He doesn't see that the end of his military capabilities, and he still trusts in Trump doing another pivot and pivoting away from Ukraine again at some point because he gets annoyed. Because I think as long as the US and Europe support Ukraine, he doesn't really have chances to get anything more than he currently does, like moving a couple of square kilometers forward on the front line every month. But if the US turn away and start delivering weapons and giving Ukraine vital information about Russian positions, he may have another chance at rapidly moving forward. So I think that's the bet. That's Putin's bet, and it became clear today.
Matt, trade deal.
Yes, it's actually a good segue here because I think the main. I'm sorry, Carla, I interrupted.
That's all I had to do is say trade deal.
Trade deal, exactly. We know what we're talking about. Putin, as you said up top, Bessent went to Geneva, got a deal with the Chinese. They reduced the tariffs for 90 days. I think that an interesting connection with the Middle East story, and there's been a lot of Trump in the world this week, and the discussion about Ukraine is that, in my view, we are seeing the return more of the dynamics of Trump 1 as Trump's first term versus what we initially saw with Trump 2. And I think the reason why the markets freaked out, a lot of the world really freaked out, a lot of the business community in this country freaked out, was that Trump 2 seemed very ideologically driven. I'm going to go full bore on protectionism. I'm going to go full bore on Putinism, domestically, potentially, certainly overseas. I'm an isolationist. This is the new religion, and I am an ideologue. This last couple of weeks have brought back Trump 1, and Trump 1 and the dynamics of Trump 1 are playing out here. And this is where Lutnick is relevant, that people around in the Trump orbit, that we know he's erratic. We know he's not exactly a deep thinker or a big reader. But if we get to him, you are able to do things that on the right of center, further right, people here really want to get done. And there is obviously this clash between people who are further right, who are new right, people who are more traditional Republicans. But what you've seen in the last couple of weeks, as things haven't worked out so well with Trump, the Messiah, you're getting back Trump, the more pragmatic approach. Well, I did all these tariffs, but this is all negotiable. Therefore, I'll reduce them. In the Middle East, I might do a deal with Iran. I might help Israel bomb Iran to the Middle Ages. Don't quite know. Similarly with Ukraine. And this means maybe it's a bit unpredictable. It's unpredictable, but it's actually more predictable in the sense that really there is an argument. It's not the usual Washington process where you have, interagency meetings and there are principals who are empowered. It's completely chaotic, like in a family office, which is basically what the White House is these days. But it means that the market is back to where it was before Liberation Day. And we don't think that the global economy is about to fall off a cliff. One brief caveat we're not out of the woods at all. This is just 90 days. The chances of recession are higher now than they were before Liberation Day because America's trade posture is much more protectionist, no matter what, than it was before then. And the risk of inflation, even though the report in April was decent, is higher than it was before. So you have the Fed, which is going to be deciding on interest rates, really, really starting to worry about, are we kind of seeing stagflation? And so anyway, that's where we are economically. But it does fit in with everything else we've discussed.
So, Prashant, let's stop talking about Donald Trump for a minute. Let's talk about another great Democrat, which is Xi. What does his decision to hang tough vis-a-vis the Americans tell us? I mean, Bassett was telling us the Chinese were gonna cave into the U.S. because their economy was in such bad shape. The Chinese seem to hang tough in all this. Is their economy not as weak as we thought? Is Xi more confident than we expected? Is the U.S. more vulnerable and he assessed us correctly? And what was his strategy here, and what does this tell us about moving forward after those 90 days?
I think one of the things I've sort of taken away from the past sort of 3 months of the trade negotiations with the Chinese, to the extent that there have been any, is everything you said is true at once. In that the Chinese economy is incredibly vulnerable, right? Like in the immediate aftermath of the trade deal, I think every major investment bank raised their forecast for Chinese GDP growth. None of them raised it to the level that the Chinese actually want, of 5%. Right, and China is still grappling with a huge mountain of debt, much of which is opaque. Youth unemployment is extremely high. Security spending is enormous. The economy, even if it was to reach 5% GDP growth, those numbers are widely disbelieved, right, in the analyst community, and inflation is, potentially dropping down into deflation. I mean, China is Japanifying at an alarming rate. And its aging population means that its pension and social security system is going to be extremely vulnerable. So the systemic problems that China faces have not gone away. It is also an extremely export-reliant economy, and the biggest market in the world has imposed 30% tariffs on it, even after these reduced after these negotiations. At the same time, the United States is extremely vulnerable for all of the reasons that we know, right? That Christmas shopping theoretically happens in October and November, but actually businesses that order those goods are ordering them now. And so we see this huge kind of problem from a trade point of view and a political point of view, and as Matt sort of rightly pointed out, an inflation point of view, a stagflation point of view, all of these things. And so, what it comes down to is, it does look like the Americans blinked and the Chinese were able to hold out, but we should not then assume that China is invulnerable, right? It does have cards it can play and has played them very well. And frankly, all the indications is it spent the last 7 years readying for this, girding its economy against what it knew might come again, and has been extremely strong at it. And, also going back to something Matt said, it's, been learning constantly from, not just the 2022 invasion, but the 2014 push into Crimea and how it sort of strengthened its financial system against the Russian sanctions that came through. I mean, China has learned a lot in the last 10 years, 10, 11 years under Xi Jinping, both from all of these kind of various interactions. The danger, though, is, again, I think we think that, China made Trump blink. China must be the stronger of the two. And I would just caution against that a little bit, just because the sort of systemic long-term problems that China faces are real. Now, they can, that doesn't mean that Xi Jinping is going to be unseated from power because of some popular revolution. But it does mean that there are sort of levers that the United States can pull. Perhaps it has not pulled them expertly yet. But it is, the power of being the biggest market in the world is real. And, Trump is trying to extract something from that power, perhaps not expertly. But I would just caution against this idea. I think correctly people have determined that the Chinese won this round, but it is very much a battle versus war situation, I would say here.
Let me just, maybe you aren't going to go this way, but I'm going to then go say what you want to say, but I have another question for you. And then, obviously there are a lot of other countries that are want to make deals with Trump. What are they taking away, including the Europeans? What are they taking away from this round with the Chinese?
Yes. I first want to just add one thing to what Prashant said. I think I absolutely agree. When you look at the two economies, the question was which of the economies can hold out longer. But I think it's also the question, a political question, which of the leaders could hold out longer against the grumbles and grumpiness and anger of their populations. And I think what this shows is that she's got the upper hand in the narrative game, because he can count on the nationalism that his regime has put in quite some effort in recent years to rouse in the Chinese population. And I've heard many reports from correspondents, not least our own, on the ground who've spoken to Chinese people who say, well, if this is an attack by the imperialist United States on our country, we will of course hold out, and we are ready to take some pain for that. And Donald Trump has tried to play out the same propaganda narrative, if you will. He started to suddenly sound like a degrowther, saying, well, we don't need 30 Barbie dolls, our kids just need 2, maybe, that's enough. But I think he knew that in the end, this wouldn't work in the United States. And as Prashant said correctly, people want their Christmas presents, and they just, they don't want one Barbie doll, but they want to give their children a lot of presents. What are the takeaways for European countries? I think they can take away that pushing back helps, and I think they will. And I think that's the posture the European Union has taken all along. They have responded to the first round of announcements in a very sensible way, not overdoing it, but signaling that they are prepared and they have prepared measures to strike back. And I think what China shows is that it works.
Matt, what's the big takeaway for the rest of the world?
I mean, the crazy thing is that, as I think Prashant made a really great point, that China is recovering, but far more slowly than it expected to. It's got huge demographic challenges. Russia began the Trump presidency, with an incredibly weak economy, again, shrinking population. These are not powers on the rise. And the U.S. began the Trump presidency where it was, in my I've argued this for years, stronger now than it has been at any point in the 21st century, for sure. Economically, it used to be on par with Europe. Now it's a third bigger, leading on AI, still unmatched militarily. And yet we've by making America great again, we've actually diminished America, at least for the first couple of months, and have, I assume inadvertently, boosted both President Putin and President Xi in ways that were unimaginable in January. These guys both have fairly weak hands versus the U.S. and are looking like they're winning this round of poker. Doesn't mean they're going to win, the night, but they are winning now. And I have not heard that critique made robustly in the U.S. because, again, we are so consumed by our own conversation about what happened in Iraq in 2004, the recession of 2009, who's to blame on the Republican side. But it is inarguable that the U.S. is playing a strong hand pretty badly right now in the world, economically and I would say diplomatically as well.
Prashant, last thought from you?
Yeah, I think the other thing that we should not lose sight of is it's the danger, to follow on from Matt's point of being a bit too myopic in how the United States interacts with China, is we're forgetting that how these other countries are interacting with each other as a result of what President Trump is doing. And, if you sort of were to look at the data, right, China's exports last month surprised to the upside, not because, and actually exports to the United States plummeted, I think by 17 to 20%. And that was largely because exports to Southeast Asia, Japan, and Europe really increased. The European Union sent all but one of its commissioners to India a couple months ago, and is trying to organize a sort of what, for lack of a better term, a skinny trade deal by the end of the year, which by European Union terms is astonishingly fast, right? The European Union plods through trade negotiations and the idea was always that if you sort of have this kind of trade negotiation with India, then everybody will want it and you'll have these kind of preferential trade deals. And in fact, it is like completely, forcing itself into new spaces. You saw just sort of earlier this week, Xi Jinping hosted sort of Latin American leaders, one of whom signed on the Belt and Road Initiative. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva had a state visit to China. Gabriel Boric went to Japan. There are new relationships forming as countries that had very strong bilateral relations with the United States start questioning whether they need new partners. And that doesn't mean that they're sort of casting the United States aside, but they are kind of hedging their bets in ways that perhaps they did not previously. And I think we should just keep that in mind too, as these new relationships form and strengthen. The United States' kind of sort of power does ebb as a result.
I wanted this more to talk about. I could go on for another hour, but then they would turn us off. So I want to thank Anna Sauerbrey for Decide, Matt Kaminski from Politico, the Wall Street Journal. We'll always have the Wall Street Journal, and Prashant Rao from Semaphore. Great conversation. Evo will be back next week. And thank you all. Great conversation, and see you all soon.
Thank you.